Um, Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Doris Blazing from ARM Consulting Group, and with me is Dr. Len Tesoriero, and we're going to talk to you today about soil-borne disease management in onions. Len has been working as a pathologist for a long time, mainly for the Department of Agriculture, but he seemed to have been all over Australia looking at diseases of many crops, including onions. So the focus is on soil-borne diseases, whereas on another time we will talk about leaf diseases, so you can wait for that. In this webinar, you can ask questions via typing them. So just here on the left of your screen should be a panel where you can type questions, and I will probably at the end go through the questions and make sure that Len answers them. So we will have about 10-15 minutes we will have for questions. So keep typing them, please. We also have an attachment which you can get from the dashboard, which is the poster on soil-borne diseases. So if you want to have a bit of a summary later, you can have that. We will also record this webinar, and people who hadn't have time can watch it later. Also, not forget the next webinar on herbicide resistance is on the 4th of June. So put that in your diary, please. And I give the stage to Len, please. And Len, if you would like to introduce yourself a bit more than I did, please feel free.
Okay, thank you, Doris. Hi, everybody. I'm Len Tesoriero. I'm a plant pathologist, long time with New South Wales GPI, and I retired a couple of years ago. And I've been working on a few different projects since then. But I have to say that onions are something I haven't worked on for a long time. So this has been a great opportunity for me to do some revision on some of the soil-borne diseases that are specific to them. I think a lot of the research in recent years has been done in Sardie in South Australia, and probably some work in Tasmania. And I'll be referring to a little bit of that as we go along. So the key soil-borne diseases that we'll look at today are damping off and some of the other diseases caused by those same pathogens, including the various fusarium diseases. We'll look at white rot, black mold, and pink root. Now, before we get going, I think it's important to look at plant diseases, and in this case, these soil-borne diseases, in the light of plant health in general. And I put this sort of schematic together a few years ago, and it's a good way to, I guess, just remind us how important all these other factors are that are associated with plant health impinge on diseases and whether or not they become a significant problem. And clearly the environment, as you can see up in the top there, is very important. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the specific environmental conditions that predispose plants to disease infection and the severity of the infection and how it spreads. Over on the right there, you can see pests, and there are some particular ones that are important in onions for spreading diseases. So we normally think of things like virus infections, but think also about some of the other insects that are sometimes what we might call more incidental. They can pick up fungal spores and move them around, and some of those can be very important. And they can also cause damage, which allows infections to occur. So some of the pathogens aren't always able to get in on their own. They require an entry, and some of that physical damage caused by pests can allow them to get in. With regards to nutrition, I've said the Goldilocks effect there, not too much and not too little. I'll speak in a couple of cases during this presentation about a few specific elements that might be important in either making plants more susceptible to disease, or in some cases help protect plants from disease. So that's an important one that we need to consider. Pesticides, and Doris just mentioned, with herbicide resistance, obviously herbicides are very important in onion production, and their timely use is very important to get a good crop. But there are some cases where pesticides and particular herbicides can predispose some plants to some diseases, and that does come across a little bit in onion production. Plant genetic resistance is another one that there's a few cases here where there are some varieties that are less susceptible, and I'll talk a little bit about plant genetic resistance or susceptibility in the case when you go out monitoring for diseases. Many years ago, when I did work on onions, I used to go out into the New South Wales Riverina and scout for diseases, and I found there were some varieties that were very susceptible to some diseases, and they become good sentinel varieties for you to use. So you can actually put them in strategically. You don't have to sow a whole field of them, but you can put them in, and they're good to monitor for when the diseases start to appear. Weeds, many of them are alternative hosts as well as being competitors. And in regards to something like pink root, which has a very wide host range, which includes a lot of weeds. So even with long rotation, sometimes any weeds that are in fallows and the like can harbour those particular pathogens and keep them going. And then in regards to the soil condition, and Doris will talk a little bit about soil health in general, but all those other factors, the pH, clearly for soil-borne diseases, drainage and irrigation management are going to come up over and over as predisposing factors if they're not good enough. So what are these soil-borne diseases? They're plant pathogens, they're microbes. In this case, we're really just dealing with fungal pathogens, and it is important to remember they're part of the complex soil environment. And in most of the cases that we'll be dealing with today, in fact, all of the cases, they're what we might call soil inhabitants. So they can survive for sometimes very long periods in the soil, even without any of your host plants there. Others are soil transients, and although we're not mentioning them here today or going into depth for them, things like the alternarias and other things can survive for a period of time in soil. Botrytis is another one, can survive in shorter term than some of these particular pathogens we'll talk about today. Well, this is an opportunity for Doris to talk, and I've just put these schematics up of the plant rhizosphere, which is really important in terms of a zone where lots of things are going on, and in the case of most of the infections from the plant pathogen, this is the zone that we really need to pay some attention to, and it's very complex. There's literally millions of different types of organisms. There's amoebae, there's bacteria, there are various fungi, good and bad, nematodes, a whole suite of different types of microbes, and they're reacting and living in that little environment about 5 millimeters around each of the roots. There's the mycorrhizae fungi, for example, that are important in onions, and they're I guess being fed by the plant as the plant sloughs off bits of the root material and exudes some of the things like amino acids, which are food for these things. So I might send it over to you, Doris, to talk a little bit about soil health.
Yep, and I think I will keep it very practical. When you look at, I like you talking about the plant roots actually feeding the microbes. What they also do, they give signals to the microbes and also to the pathogens. So if the plants are stressed, for instance, through herbicide application, they will give different signals, and weak plants actually give signals to pathogens. So that's one thing to remember. But I mean, a very practical experience is when I worked for one of the big onion exporters in Tasmania. We had a whole bunch of field officers and about 100 farmers growing onions for us, and there were always the same producers having the best onions. And then when you visit them, you could see what they were doing differently from the worst producers. And one thing they were doing, they had a wider rotation. They had cover crops, and often that was pasture because that's what's easy to do in Tassie. but certainly you could actually walk into the soil later in the season. There were no weeds, and the soil was still quite fluffy. So one of the big aspects of soil health management to me is, I will say, keep the soil in a condition where you have good oxygen supply and no compaction. Most pathogens and soil living pathogens like moist soil and moisture, and often they're quite happy if it's too wet, but other microbes are not. So minimum tillage, cover crops, maybe a strip tillage, they're all keeping organic matter up. They're all really important in actually any crop, and the rotation. So we find close rotations are usually an issue and poor weed control in soil health management. And another one is really often putting too much effort in with putting nitrogen on to get size rather than balancing nutrition, for instance, looking especially at calcium and potassium. So I might leave it to that. So if people like to know more about soil health management, I would recommend to have a good surf through our website called soilwealth.com.au.
Thanks, Doris. So we'll move on now to I guess one of the important things for integrated management of these diseases is monitoring. And I mentioned how in my, I guess in my youth, I did a lot of monitoring of onion crops, and I guess the sort of things you're looking for right from the beginning are things like establishment failures and patches, poorer growth in the field. As I mentioned before, those sentinel varieties can be really important. And I was looking particularly at downy mildew, and I found that certain varieties that were very susceptible to downy were things that I could go and monitor first, and they'd give me an indication as to whether or not they're appearing in a particular area or on a particular farm. And of course, pre-plant soil tests have now become available. And so for some of the fungal pathogens we're talking about today, you can actually get those sorts of tests done to give you, I guess, an understanding of what level of risk you might have. So let's look at, in particular, some of the diseases, and the seed rot, damping off, and stunt I've sort of grouped together, mainly because even though there's, as you can see, several pathogens associated with them, the symptoms are always very similar in terms of, failure to establish patches of plants that are either stunted or damping off or dying off. But you can see that there are various different species of Pythium. So Pythium being a water mold generally tells you that wet soil conditions are going to favour it. There's a few different species there. They're what I would call generally the common cold pathogens. They're very common in soils. They can multiply up pretty quickly under the right conditions, and particularly young plants that are just emerging from seed, they can cause those sorts of rots that mean that the plants just fail, or they linger on for a little bit and then eventually wilt away. The fungus Rhizotonia is a little bit different. You can see there I've listed AG21, and I know they're technical terms, but those particular terms, really, when we think about it, they're really almost like different species. And so they have different host ranges too. So it's important when we understand them at that subspecific level, that we can sometimes help to put together more sensible rotations once you know which ones you have. And then, of course, the one that causes the patch disease, mainly that AG8, I've said that in South Australia. I read that in WA they reckon it's AG4, which I'm a little bit surprised about, but having not sort of done any work over there, I'm not absolutely sure of that. But AG8 is a cereal pathogen, so that's the one that causes bare patch in cereals. So I'll talk a little bit more about that and the implications of having that in your crop as we go. And then there's the Fusarium species, and Some of them aren't all that well characterised on onions, but in particular that Fusarium oxysporum is the main one that causes the basal rot of onions, and I guess I see it in things like leeks and other types of alliums as well. There's a picture that I managed to get from this best practice guide on onion stunt put out by the South Australians and through Hort Innovation. And you can see there that the aerial view is important in being able to monitor on those very big areas of onions. But you can see the patches there, and quite a distinct disease, and obviously severe enough to warrant some attention. When you look closely at the roots, you can see that there's those typical, what we call spear pointed, where there's necrosis around the tips of the roots. That's where the Rhizoctonia fungus mainly attacks. And I noticed too in this image, this is one of the images from that guide, there's a bit of basal plate rot. So it wouldn't surprise me, and it's important to know that a lot of these soil-borne pathogens actually do form complexes. So you will find more than one thing in there. And so I'd be a little bit suspicious that that might also have some Fusarium infection as well. Other types of rots caused by the Fusaria, there's bulb rot, which is another important one. And one of the key factors for a lot of these diseases is high soil moisture, poor drainage, and in many cases where there's some compaction. So a bit like what Doris was talking about in terms of soil health, we have to think about the sorts of factors that will predispose plants to infection. And in this case, having organic matter on the soil surface, particularly for Rhizoctonia, can be quite important. Generally cooler temperatures, so those Pythium species I mentioned, they can grow down to about 1 degree Celsius, so they can grow in very cold soils, cold wet soils. They usually favour them. And of course plant damage, whether it's mechanical, as Doris mentioned about herbicide and some of those pre-emergent herbicides that can have a lingering effect on the young plants as they emerge. Insect attack, nematodes. So there's a fair bit of commentary about some of the root lesion nematodes in some of those sandy soils in South Australia as being other things that can give rise to damage. And then of course poor crop rotation. So it is important to note that the Rhizoctonia stunt, that AG8, causes bare patch in cereals and sorghum. So particularly where you've got those sorts of rotations, you can end up with a problem. Let's look at some of the management strategies now, and probably some of these probably would go for all the diseases I'm talking about today, but seed quality is important. Using fresher seed that's not physiologically aged can be important for things like just the vigor that they have in getting them out of the ground, and in some cases to escape infection caused by things like those Pythium. If you've only got a very small, slowly growing root system, then it's very easy for the Pythium to actually colonise that. And even though the plant could grow away from it if it was growing quicker with more roots, then it wouldn't be as likely to become infected. What else have we got? Sorry, I just got a phone message. Some of those persistent herbicides I mentioned. Oh, there are chemical seed dressings that are useful, particularly for things like Pythium. Irrigation management and improved drainage. So again, using beds is always seen as a way of improving drainage. And avoiding ammonium nitrogen, and I'm saying that in regards to Fusarium, which generally the Fusarium oxysporums, the ones that cause wilt diseases, or in the case of onions, the basal rot, they tend to be favoured by the ammonium form of nitrogen, or the acidifying conditions brought on by ammonium nitrogen. So you just need to be careful if you are applying those sorts of fertilisers to not put them all out in one go, put them out in more than, over time rather than all in one hit. So you just don't want to bump it up too quickly. Organic matter, and Doris mentioned things like green manures and composts. Just making sure, as I said, with that rhizoctonia, that you don't have poorly decomposed material sitting on the surface of the soil, because that will favour rhizoctonia, which will then colonise that and then move into your plant, into your emerging plants. Cover crops and biofumigants. So some of those brassicas that are used as biofumigants can be very useful for just dropping the population of some of these soil-borne pathogens down. Fumigation is used, I know, for some of these pathogens, so it's another solution, generally considered a bit of a short-term solution. Things like methane can end up causing problems with what we call enhanced biodegradation, where bacteria in the soil actually break it down much more quickly and it doesn't end up working as effectively as it should. So there are some issues with continued use of fumigants. Balanced nutrition and things like calcium and zinc amendments can sometimes be used to, I guess, improve the plant's resilience to some of the infections caused by these pathogens. Microbial biocontrols, there's none registered in Australia for onions for these sorts of diseases, but there's plenty of international literature that shows that they can be effective. I always say, though, one of the problems with not having registered formulations is that, one, a lot of products that are sold aren't they'll tell you on the label how much is there, but you've got no way of knowing whether the populations of the biocontrol agents are actually what is said on the bottle or on the tin. The timing, and I'll refer to this a little bit later in the talk about timing for some of the biologicals, and the application methods. So a lot of those things really haven't been worked through properly for many of the crops that I work on, and onions are probably in a similar situation. A lot of trial and error goes on, but I still think they're worth exploring further. Some of the micronutrient mobilizers and decomposition accelerators, now they're relatively new to me, but my understanding is they're starting to be used more. So, for example, if you're using things like cover crops and green manures or even compost, sometimes it's important to maybe apply things like this that might actually hasten the decomposition, so that you don't end up with all this cellulosic substrate for things like rhizoctonia to grow on and then start to infect your plants. And again, I'll mention here that pre-plant soil tests are available for the Pythium and the rhizoctonias. Unfortunately, I don't think they're available for the Fusarium. So we'll move on to white rot. This one being an important one. I guess I've seen more of this problem in things like spring onion crops up my way, where there's not a lot of onions grown. But I think in Tassie there was a lot of work done on this particular disease many years ago. It's caused by Sclerotium cepivorum, and it's important to know that this is an ascomycete and it's related to the Sclerotinia group. So things like Sclerotinia and botrytis are related to this particular fungus. And as with both Sclerotinia and botrytis, it forms these little sclerotia, these little black resting bodies, which are the main form that it can survive. And it can survive, unfortunately, many, many years in the soil. And what's interesting about this particular fungus is that it's actually the volatiles released by the alliums, by the plants, that actually stimulate the germination of those sclerotia. So they can sit dormant for many years, and then when you put an onion crop in, those root exudates then allow the sclerotia to germinate. And it's favoured by, like I've been talking about for the damping off problems, cool and wet soils, so the optimum soil temperature is around 14 to 18 degrees for that sclerotial germination to occur. In terms of management, and not everybody has this problem, so it is important if you don't have sclerotium white rot, that you have good farm biosecurity to avoid introducing it to your crop. So it's not seed-borne, but it can be carried with infected soil and machinery and the like. So just watch out for that if you don't have it. I found that increasing manganese and copper availability can be effective in helping to minimise the effects of this disease. Or so that's an association I found in the literature. So that's just something to remember when I talked about nutrition right at the beginning. It's just making sure that you're balancing up all of your nutrients, and in particular for this disease, manganese and copper can be important. There are some fungicide treatments that can be used either on seed or in furrow at sowing, and they generally are in these registrations in the group 2 and 3. So that's the things like iprodone and the DMI fungicides in group 3, those epiconazole, those sorts of products. And as I said, curiously, there aren't any of the other groups registered for onions. I'm not sure why, but they can be used for other diseases, the group 11s and the like, but they're not registered for this disease on onions. So I don't know if much work has been done there. Soil fumigation, I mentioned earlier, and biofumigation, as I mentioned, for the damping off diseases. Cover crops to increase that microbial diversity in the soil, which gets us to this idea of the biocontrols. And a lot of the trichodermas are already present in your soils. It's just a matter of building them up. And those trichodermas and that other fungus there that I've mentioned, excuse me, Coniothyria minitans, is actually, they're able to colonise those sclerotia in the soil and drop the population down. So one thing I would be doing if I was actually applying biocontrols is I'd put it on my crop residues after a crop to try and stimulate the infection of formed sclerotia while they're nice and fresh. Excuse me. But as I said, with some of the other organic amendments, you'll be introducing some of these and stimulating trichodermas anyway. So for white rot, long rotations, unfortunately, they can survive for a long period. So generally, it's probably not a realistic thing that you're going to get longer rotations that are going to, on their own, give you control. And I know some work was done in Tasmania a while ago with this chemical, which this is the sort of the chemical that's released by onions to stimulate infection. So if you're able to add this particular type of, it's a sulfide type product, to the soil without any onions present, then you can stimulate the germination of the sclerotia, and then there's no infection that can occur, and so you can knock the population down over time that way. I know it's registered in New Zealand, but there's nothing registered in Australia, to my knowledge, for this.
No, it's a bit, there is a bit of work done in the US at the moment with that. So watch this space.
Yeah, hopefully that would be something that you would use well before you'd put your onion crop in. And increasing plant spacing. So one of the things about the sclerotia and their germination, they can't grow forever in the soil on their own. After the sclerotia have germinated, the little threads of fungal mycelium, if the plants are tightly spaced, then they can move from plant to plant and give you bigger infections. So if you're in an area where you know you've had the problem previously, and I found the same thing with downy mildew control, that sometimes increasing the plant spacing can be a really easier way, even though you've got fewer plants per hectare, you actually might end up with a better crop yield because you're actually keeping those plants healthier.
Len,
So black mold.
Teresa, can I interrupt you briefly? Sorry, just
Sure.
Teresa Chapman from RMCG speaking from behind the scenes. We just fielded a question from John Duff that I thought it would be interesting to answer before you move on. What's the go with biofumigation and white rot? What evidence do we have there? How effective is it?
I don't have any direct evidence for it, but a bit like, because it's similar to sclerotinia, then I would imagine that some of those biofumigants would have some effect on them. That's something I think John should be researching. I can't say that I'm aware of any specific information other than the general view that biofumigants can reduce, because they've got a general fumigation action. So the chemicals that are released, for example, from the brassicas are similar to methamphetamine sodium, so that isothiocyanates have got a general response to infection, to plant pathogens. So whether or not the dormant sclerotia are affected by that, I'm not absolutely sure.
I think the general improvement. The general improvement to soil health with the biofumigants seems to be effective as well, because you talk about derma, and so you get a general effect anyway.
Yeah, that's right. That general suppression, I think, is one of the key things with cover cropping. Okay, so black mold, and this is one I did do some work on back in the 80s, down in the Riverina in New South Wales, and those are the very typical symptoms that appear. Generally, something that appears post-harvest, where you've had very high temperatures with moisture, and this was something we found that occurred in the warmer years. There's another disease called blue mold, which is a penicillium that we would get in the cooler years. So down in the New South Wales Riverina, we'd have really hot years and we'd get aspergillus, and in the cooler years we'd get penicillium. And you can see there that at temperatures above 30 degrees in the field or above 24 degrees in storage, in association with high relative humidity and free moisture for up to 12 hours an onion. So they're the requirements for infection and development of disease. And of course, physical damage and bruising. So that's why quite often you'll get infection through the stalk end. And in some cases, deficiencies of calcium can give rise to an increase in the severity of infection. In terms of management, and this is something I remember we withdrew irrigation. So it's obviously been known for a long time, because it would have been in about 1982 that I did this work. We found where we monitored onions through their development, and the infection really escalated in the last few weeks before harvest. And so withdrawing irrigation in that period, although it means you don't end up with maybe the onions as big as you'd want them, you end up with much healthier onions, particularly if the weather conditions are conducive to this particular disease. Bruising and mechanical injury, particularly during harvest, is really important in terms of providing infection points for the disease. And of course, having proper curing and drying facilities can reduce the disease significantly. And I noticed there's one fungicide that's registered, so that's Switch, which is the fludioktanol. Proper nutrition is also another thing I found. Decreased storage rots, so that's another thing that can be applied prior to harvest, and some varieties are less affected. So again, choice of varieties could be important if you're sowing into the and plants will be ready for harvest in the hottest part of the year, and you're in those sorts of areas where the disease is prevalent. Pink root comes under a couple of different names. Phoma terrestris was the name I grew up with. It's also Pyrenocheta. And I noticed when I was doing a bit of looking on the web, Cetophoma is another name for it now, but I think most people would know it as Phoma terrestris as the cause. When I sort of looked at onions years ago, I didn't think it was such an important disease, but as I've read more about it in the last few days, I can see that it's able to cause some significant problems. Also, it seems to be something that enables secondary infections by other things. So by causing the leaf tips to start to yellow and die off, you can get stem phyllium and alternaria, some of those other common foliar diseases coming in. And similarly, down in the root system, fusarium and pythium and rhizotonia can come in and form root complexes with this particular fungus. One of the issues with it is it's got this very wide host range, which includes cereals and things like sweet corn and sorghum and many other different plant species. So very typical symptoms, although I think sometimes a fusarium or two can maybe give similar symptoms with that pinking in the roots themselves. But for the most part, in onions, I'm pretty sure that it would be unmistakable as this particular pink root. So it's recommended that rotations go out to about 5 or 6 years. One of the problems, of course, is that whatever you're putting in is probably going to be susceptible as a rotation crop. So it makes it a little trickier. There are some varieties with that are less susceptible. So obviously, if that's something that you can put in, you could choose your variety. It's funny, I remember one grower who had the problem. He said to me, "Oh, don't worry about pink root, Len. I just grow rice after onions." And obviously, if you look in the literature, you'll find that sort of anaerobic, what they call anaerobic fumigation, if you like, it's basically making, I wouldn't recommend it in the sense that it can't be great for the soil microbial population overall, but it does actually knock out this pink root. And of course, not everyone's in a position to have a rotation with rice. But scheduling crops might be something that you can do, that you can, I guess, try and harvest the plants before those critical temperatures are reached where it's favourable for infection and the development of the disease. Avoiding moisture stress seems to be important. So again, not putting all your irrigation out in one go, but having more frequent but lower volumes of irrigation can be important. Fumigation is an option still, and using cover crops. Now, please don't ask me what cover crops. I was scratching my head trying to think of what particular cover crops you could use, and the short answer is I don't really know. I guess that's something, again, if John's out there, I don't know if you've got any experience, John, with what cover crops may not be a host for this particular fungus, but it's something that needs to be explored. So moving on. So just to summarise then, I think the most important thing about managing any disease, but particularly these soil-borne diseases, is understanding hepatic history, having good records, establishing the level of risk, whether it's through things like getting soil tests pre-sowing, taking preventative actions. So in the case of whether or not you choose particular rotations or fallows, or if you're going to even go to the length of fumigation or using biofumigants. Monitoring the crops and areas of the field. Thing I found when I did a lot of the monitoring was that I'd find that for some diseases, they'd always appear in one area of a field. So varieties can be important, but also sometimes you might know that there's an area of your paddock that doesn't drain as well, and so that'll be where the disease tends to start to appear first. So that monitoring can be very important, and keeping records. If I could say two things there, that they're very important. Ensuring they're identified correctly. A lot of these are pretty well self-evident, but as I mentioned, particularly for those stamping off problems, sometimes, you know, your choice of seed dressing might depend on which particular pathogens you've got there. Obviously, for the rhizoctonia and the bare patch type thing, you might need to have that identified down to that sub-specific level to know whether or not it's the AG8 that is also going to affect cereals if that's your key rotation. Applying these integrated strategies. So as I said, you know, using as many options as you can. And a thing to note, I suppose, that when using either the microbials or the agrochemicals, make sure they're applied at the appropriate time, and I guess make sure that you've got some evidence that they'll actually work. So do trials before you start using, particularly things that don't have full registration. Make sure they're trialed so you know that they're actually going to do something for you. So we've pretty much covered everything I was going to cover, so thanks, and I'm hoping there's some more questions.
Yeah, if I can start, I actually want to make a couple of comments. We have under the soils project for vegetables, we have put together with actually Teresa's help, who's in the background, who doesn't want us to see her, a database on biological crop protection products, whether registered or not registered. So if people actually want to go and have a look at that database, which gives you an overview of what we're finding out there, have a look again at the Soil Wealth website, soilwealth.com.au for that one. And also don't forget that there is a farm biosecurity manual for onions, which got some great photos in it, because some of the biosecurity incursion plants can look very similar to you know, diseases and symptoms we already have. And you know what, at the moment a virus can do to us, a virus can also do to crops. So maybe we get a bit more alert for biosecurity. Another one, I was actually a question for Len, is you said using older or fresh seed. However, I thought for controlling botrytis, we used to use a year-old seed. Is that a bit of a problem then?
I guess if botrytis is an issue, but what I mean is that it's not too physiologically aged, because generally what happens if the seed, as the seed gets older, it loses vigor and it'll be slower to germinate. And it's true for many different types of crops, but particularly for things like Pythium attack. Pythium seems to attack slower things that are slower to germinate. So if the seed is older and it's germinating very slowly, it'll be more affected by things like Pythium than fresher seed.
I guess one thing I learned from people who do regular DNA testing of soils is that sometimes using for instance, a nematicide to get rid of one issue like nematodes, they found that in the testing an increase in Pythium or rhizosphere. So you can actually, with the soil testing and the DNA testing, learn how these relationships work in your own paddocks. So it's not, you know, it doesn't tell you on a label, it tells you what is going to be killed, but it doesn't tell you what's going to be supported. So you can actually get rid of one problem and find another.
Yeah,
now,
that's right.
We move on. I just have a couple of questions for our attendees, a couple of polls. So if you guys wouldn't mind quickly answering these questions, I just want to know where you're listening from. So if you quickly tick your state, and I've put other there in case there's next to New South Wales, in case there's people from outside of Australia or the Northern Territory, or I didn't put Western Australia. Damn it, sorry everybody. They only allowed me that many options.
Oh, it's only a small piece of Australia.
Pick other WA. Sorry, Western Australians, if there's anyone listening.
They can ring you, abuse you later.
Yeah, that's right. Tassie gets forgotten a lot too. Sometimes we don't even appear on the pictures of Australia, so we know how it feels. So if everyone just quickly clicks something, then we should be able to get back to the webinar.
And I hope some more people have questions.
Okay, I might just close that poll, and then I've just got one more poll, which is, did you find the information in this webinar useful? Which is just super good for us to know one way or the other, so that we can always be improving our projects for you, the growers. And
also, if you have issues or didn't like it, please let us know as well. You can just write an email to Teresa or I, because
yeah, and we're really interested in knowing what you'd like to hear about for future webinars or maybe events at some mad future time when we're not all restricted to our own
or which
states
people
and
you would
homes.
like to listen. Yeah, we could even, I mean, it's possible to actually put in a webinar where we have people from overseas, so we could get some of the overseas researchers or people you like to hear from. That's one opportunity to do in webinars, to get people from the Northern Hemisphere.
You could probably stop sharing your screen, Len, and then we would see you a bit more.
Oh, can't you see me?
Large. Well, we can. You're just small at the top.
Oh, am I? Oh, okay.
Yeah, I actually did see there are a few people from South Australia, and an added issue in South Australia, apart from the heat, is salinity. So in the last couple of years, salinity has certainly been rising. Salinity in the water, and with that, soil salinity. And Len mentioned a few times the importance of calcium as a, helping with resilience against diseases, and that's a really important aspect to consider when you have problems with salinity. Make sure there's enough calcium in the soil, and soluble calcium, so that would be more the calcium nitrates or other calcium sources rather than gypsum or lime. And also be careful that the plants get enough potassium nutrition, especially when they start growing their bulbs, because unfortunately the sodium is part of the issue in salinity, and the sodium is taken up by plants easier or just as easy as potassium. And it seems from the plant testing I've done that sodium is a definite indicator, in plants when there's salinity or sodicity issues. And having enough calcium and potassium, especially in potassium, even as a foliar, is a very good way of providing more resilience to plants. Even now, I remember when I worked on downy mildew in poppies, but there might be some similarities. Keeping up potassium was an important crop management aspect for downy mildew. So the nutrition, and I think we've got a webinar recording actually with Len on nutrition and diseases, again on the famous Soilworth website. It's recorded there, so that might be something to look out for.
Yeah, thanks, Doris.
Are there any questions? You seem to be all having no issues, and Len is still not still sharing his screen.
Oh, I can't. I don't. I'm still
That's
learning
right.
to drive. I'm sorry.
There should be a stop sharing sort of symbol somewhere, Len, but I can't see what you can see. So
it's all right. Don't worry.
Yes, we can probably, there's no further questions from the audience, so we can probably just wrap a little bit early if everyone's happy with that. People can go on about their afternoons. John Duff did say he would love to do some research on biofumigation and white rot. So if any funding bodies are listening, feel free to get in touch with John Duff.
Actually, one of the things I did notice going through all of this and revising a lot of the information, there's a lot of gaps in terms of what management practices would be best and when best to apply them. So yeah, I did have a look at that biocontrol thing that you guys put together. Very good. A lot more products I guess, being promoted out there than I knew about. So it just shows you that growers and people are giving options to growers. Unfortunately, when they're not registered, it makes it a bit trickier. But really, there needs to be some research to understand the optimum use patterns for some of these things. Because, as I said, when I looked at that Coniatharium, which there is some development work going on in Australia for sclerotinia control in vegetables, it's also useful for this particular crop for sclerotium. So I'm not aware of any research that's being done in that area in Australia. Might be another reason why it's good to get some overseas people involved.
Well, one of our issues in Australia is the registration system. So if you have a biological product, you still have to use the normal system with the APVMI, whereas in Europe and in the US, there are special rules for registration of biologicals, which is very important, I find, but at the moment we just don't have that. So a lot of these products are imported as fertilizers, or which I don't really like, but I can understand why people do it. So and the research is limited for that reason.
Len, there's one more question there. Sorry, I didn't spot it earlier. Michael Retke asks if you have any comments on brassicas going before onions and their impact on mycorrhizal fungi.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, that's the point, I suppose, that I didn't really talk much about mycorrhizae. The onions are a big plant group for mycorrhizae, and so mycorrhizae are beneficial fungi that help plants in a number of ways to gain nutrition, and also to they've been shown to be helpful against preventing disease infection. And unfortunately, brassicas are not mycorrhizal, so they're, I guess, a crop that, because when the residues break down, might even reduce the amount of mycorrhizae in soil. Again, I don't know. I think, Mike, that's something you need to do some research in South Australia on.
As part of the cover crop project, actually Kelvin has done a lot of testing on mycorrhizae in cover crops and the following vegetable crops. And from talking to him just not long ago, there were only 2 sites where he found a lot of mycorrhizae. One of them is actually in South Australia with one of the greenhouse growers with the brown produce. And I can't remember the other one. So generally, unfortunately, onions were not included because it's a different levy. So we don't really know much about mycorrhizae and onions, but we can test it. So that would be another, if any research funding bodies are listening, another area of research to actually look at more the mycorrhiza and the rhizosphere health and soil biology in general in onions, I think could be quite interesting, and together with resilience to diseases.
And Doris, I noticed in that microbial biocontrol list, there are mycorrhizal products available. So again, I don't know how specific they'd work with onions, but again, you know, work needs to be done. There's a lot we don't know.
No, so, I mean, one thing I learned about the biologicals is you can't use them like chemicals, and usually if the soil conditions are really bad, you're usually wasting your money. So it is an enhancement when, you know, things are reasonably good. You can make them even better. That's what I found. But it's like, especially microbial products, you need a minimum in organic matter, and you need some kind of favorable conditions for them to work. So I like the idea to use some of them with crop residues, for instance. And the monitoring is really important. So again, I think actually Mike is listing up, but I'm pretty sure that Sadi can actually also look at mycorrhiza, whether it's there or not. So that might be of interest to some people.
Yeah. Okay. Well, not sure if there's any other questions, Therese.
No.
No other questions.
Okay.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining the webinar, and I hope you got
Yes.
something out.
And
Thanks.
be in touch with requests, please. And don't forget 4th of June, herbicide resistance with Peter Butsalis. A very important topic.
Okay, guys.
Okay. Goodbye.
Cheerio.